My name's Eben Upton. I'm one of the founders of Raspberry Pi and the chief executive of Raspberry Pi Limited. I was exploring how cheaply you could make something that was recognizably a general purpose computer for end users. And I'd been doing this, I was doing this as early as 2006, which really is a couple of years before the formal start of the Raspberry Pi program. At the same time that I was investigating how cheaply you could build a computer, I was also a director of studies in computer science at St John's College at the University of Cambridge. And the director of studies role, it's a fantastic role. Actually, one of my co-founders, Rob Mullins, was my successor as director of studies there. It's a fantastic role. You organize the undergraduate teaching for a subject, which is wonderful because you get to hang out with a lot of incredibly bright young people. And you're also responsible for, to some degree, for arranging for there to be more undergraduates. So you're responsible for the pipeline of school students who might apply to your course. And while the first part of the job was a lot of fun, the second part of the job was terrible because we've had virtually nobody. I was exposed for the first time to the fact that in probably the decade between my coming to Cambridge and my being director of studies, the level of interest in computer science among young people had really collapsed. And so that was the social problem we were trying to address. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of people have tried to address this problem in a lot of different ways, but the way that we tried to address it was by building a piece of hardware. Well, there's a hypothesis, right? And the hypothesis is, looking back at the way I got involved in computing in the 1980s, pretty much every classroom in the UK in the 1980s had a BBC microcomputer built by a little Cambridge company called Acorn in the corner of the room. And that was a programmable piece of hardware. And it wasn't a program, I think it's important that it wasn't a programmable piece of hardware that existed solely to teach people about programming. It was in an educational environment, it was a piece of hardware which existed to run educational software. So what do people do with it in the classroom? English teaching applications, French teaching applications, maths applications. In the home, people were using it for word processing, people were using it to play computer games on. But this is not a programmable machine for programming's sake, but it is a programmable computer. And many of us, people of my generation, I'm 44 years old now, people who are between the ages of maybe 40 and 60, may well have had some experience as a young person with an accidental experience of programming with a programmable computer in their environment. What this did was generate, and certainly that experience was very common among my contemporaries when I arrived at Cambridge in 1996. And if you have a lot of people exposed to programming, some of them will get very into programming, some of them will decide that they want to make computing their educational subject choice. Many of them will decide they want to make computing. Even people who haven't gone through university may well decide that they want to make computing or electrical engineering or engineering more broadly their choice of career. Now, if you take away those programmable computers, and that's really what happened at the end of the 1980s, particularly in the home, particularly in that games role, you saw a replacement of those BBCs and Commodores and Sinclair machines with computer games consoles. These are awesomely powerful pieces of computing hardware, but they are, because of their business model and the architectural decisions, both the technical architectural decisions and the business architectural decisions behind them, they're no longer programmable by the end user. And so really Raspberry Pi, we happened on this hypothesis that our students had disappeared because readily available programmable hardware had disappeared, and therefore the natural hypothesis test and the natural intervention to try to address this problem was to reintroduce the concept of general purpose programmable computing into the home and classroom. I think it drew an enormous amount of inspiration, certainly from the two Cambridge machines, certainly from the educational orientation of the BBC microcomputer and the design to cost orientation of the Sinclair machines. Obviously updated for the modern era, probably that first machine I built in 2006 wasn't vastly more powerful. It was certainly vastly cheaper, but it was not vastly more powerful than those machines from the, all of its metrics would be very recognizable to somebody using a computer in the late 80s or early 1990s. So it was a device that had a processor that ran at a few megahertz. It had half a megabyte of memory. It would output to a standard definition television. So those are all very, they're very Sinclair, BBC Micro feeling things, or maybe at the high end, maybe kind of Commodore Amiga or Atari ST feeling things. It certainly didn't feel anything like a modern computer, even from the mid-90s, let alone the mid-2000s. So there was but as we moved from those first experiments in 2006 through to the launch of the first real Raspberry Pi computer in 2012, there was definitely a convergence. There was both a performance convergence. We were adding performance to our prototypes much faster than industry was adding performance at the bleeding edge. So you could see our prototype somehow catching up in terms of statistics, catching up with a modern computer, to the point where we were probably at the point of launch of Raspberry Pi. 2012's Raspberry Pi was maybe equivalent to 2002's $1,000 desktop PC. So you see a catching up in terms of a quantitative catching up, but also a kind of convergence in terms of architecture and a convergence in terms of capability. So this was no longer something that ran a very specialized bare metal operating system environment. This was something that ran Linux and would run a web browser, would run an Office application, would run Python or a C compiler or Scratch. I think for me, well, we incorporated the foundation in 2008. By 2008, if you think we were having our first thoughts in 2006, by 2008 we had a plan, we had a hypothesis we wanted to test. We had a more advanced piece of hardware than the one that I had in my hands in 2006, but still something which was a long way away from the product that we launched. In particular, it wasn't a Linux PC. It still had a bare metal operating system environment. It was substantially more powerful. By 2010, we actually did have in our hands something which was an ARM Linux-based PC. And in 2011, we were very keen to put the BBC brand on this. I grew up with the BBC Micro. The British Broadcasting Corporation has a brand which has always been quite intimately associated with computing education. Very keen not to, I think we have a fantastic brand now in Raspberry Pi, but we never wanted to have our own brand. And we had a series of conversations with the BBC to sort of get an idea of whether they would be interested in applying their brand, bringing their brand and our piece of hardware together. And really our last attempt to do this was in May of 2011 when David Braben and I went to see Rory Cellan-Jones at the BBC. And we said, look, here's a prototype. What do you think of the idea? And he, well, first of all, we said, can we put the BBC brand on it? And he was, Rory's always a very modest chap. And he said that he felt that we'd overestimated the position of a journalist in the BBC hierarchy. But he did say, look, I'll tell you what I can do for you. I can take a little video of you holding it up and talking about what you're trying to accomplish, and I'll put it on my blog. And he put it on his blog. And we had 600,000 YouTube views in 2 days for that video, which was just exceptional. But I remember sitting down across the table from Liz, my wife and later co-founder, on that second day, on the evening of that second day, and having that moment where you realize that you just told 600,000 people you were going to build them a $25 PC. And you had, it's excessive to say we had no idea how we were going to do it, but they kind of certainly, from a technical standpoint, we knew how we were going to do it, but from a business standpoint, from a business engineering, business technical standpoint, we had no real idea how we were going to do that. And the demonstration that we could do it for $25 really was on the back of a napkin. Was on the level of adding together the 3 or 4 most expensive chips on the board, so the central processor, the application processor, the memory, the networking device, adding those together, observing that the big ticket items come to much, much less than $25 and kind of assuming that everything would be fine. Spent a lot of time in 2011 getting from that point to the point where we had something which we could build at scale and something that we could build at cost. And I think the thing that sustained us through those tricky first few months was really a conviction that you had to apply a very large discount factor to the 600,000 people. That it's very easy to watch a video on YouTube, and it requires much less commitment to watch a video on YouTube and be enthusiastic about it than it does to actually go out and buy a product. So the thing that sustained us was the idea that we actually still probably only needed to build a few thousand of these to meet our educational goals and to meet the demand that Rory had drummed up for us. The point where I knew we were in trouble was in November, because we put an operating system image out, an SD card image, a very primitive, I think Fedora-based operating system image on the website. And this thing would only run in QEMU, right? So there was no hardware. It would run in a modified version of QEMU. And we had 50, 60,000 downloads of an operating system, of a broken operating system for a machine that didn't exist. And I think this was probably the point where we realized that we really had a problem. We are kind of warriors for general purpose computing. The general purpose computer is it's the most powerful tool that humankind has ever invented, right? And weirdly, it has no right to exist. So it's the widespread existence of general purpose computing, certainly in the hands of consumers, is a historical accident. That it happened that for a while, the most cost-effective way to provide consumers with the sorts of application computing they wanted, so the ability to do word processing, run educational software in a classroom, play a computer game, the most cost-effective object which met those goals was a general purpose computer. Now, over time, people found ways to, this big chunk of general purpose computing was nibbled away at. It was nibbled away at from the sides. People found ways to do some of those things more effectively using what I would call application or appliance computing, a device which runs content, runs software, runs content, which was developed somewhere else and where you have no ability. Either it is difficult or by design impossible for you to sit down in front of that device and program it yourself. And the problem with it's a good thing in a lot of ways. It is good that people can sit down. It's good that you can go out and you can spend $300 or $400 and buy a really very, very capable games console which is cost effective because it has been very finely optimized to just be there to play computer games and videos. And it's also cost effective for you, the consumer, because it has the business engineering around it, the business model around it, allows the platform holder to subsidize that piece of hardware into your hand in return for the expectation that they will then monopolize the sale of software that runs on it. So those are good things, right? Those give people access to, that your mobile phone is an appliance computer. It's an awesomely powerful and useful object. And so this is not a bad thing. So what we're really talking about is the disappearance of general purpose computers from consumers' hands, where previously they were in your hands as a side effect of the business model that surrounded them. To a large extent, of course, so from the point of view of doing the thing you intended to do with the object, it's not a problem that general purpose computers have gone away. The problem is that what we've done is there was an accidental ladder propped up. These things propped up a ladder, and at the top of the ladder was studying computer science at university or becoming a professional electrical engineer, computer programmer, engineer of various other varieties. Because you've got to remember, computing, we're not just talking about electrical engineering and computer science, we're talking about computers having been for an entire generation or two of children, probably their best shot at getting an experience of engineering in general, of the engineering mindset in general. So what we've done is we've lost this accidental benefit. It's a problem in the educational domain. In the business domain, which increasingly we do care about, in the sort of enabling startup businesses. So a lot of what I'm proudest of with Raspberry Pi, proud of the educational accomplishments, but also very proud of the role that we've played in helping small groups of people start businesses and providing a platform, providing a cost-effective hardware platform for people to build businesses around. The disappearance of general purpose computing there is, the impact there is really quite profound. That large corporations, because what it does is it entrenches advantages that large corporations who can get access to the latest technology have over the plucky young upstart. General purpose computing is a wonderful tool. It may not continue to exist unless we work hard to make it exist. I would, the places I'm excited about the use of Raspberry Pi in business, in commerce, in industry, what a lot of them have in common is that they are freeing up companies to focus on the things they do that are really differentiating. Certainly when we started Raspberry Pi, there were a huge number of, and we would encounter a huge number of what I consider to be what I would call reluctant hardware companies. So they were companies who had some differentiating piece of generally software or media IP, and they had to build a piece of hardware because there was no cost-effective piece of hardware on which you can't just deliver software, you have to deliver a piece of software and some hardware that it runs on. The PC, the conventional legacy PC, is for a variety of reasons often not the right platform. Sort of more embedded computing platforms, again, not desperately available, and where they are available, not desperately cost effective. And so what Raspberry Pi has done for these businesses, and so some of these are businesses that already existed, and some of these are businesses that have been able to come into existence because, that would not have been able to come into existence without Raspberry Pi. What they've done is they've provided a standard, cost-effective, optimized platform that these businesses can run their software on. And sort of very early examples for Raspberry Pi, the Raspberry Pi 1 era, where the processor side of the design was not desperately performant, but the multimedia side was disproportionately powerful. Some of those early applications are things like digital signage and thin clients, things that exist primarily to drive a display. And then as we dial up the performance, there's about a factor of 50 performance difference between Raspberry Pi 1 and a modern Raspberry Pi 4. As you dial that performance up, you get a broader and broader range of applications. So you start to see people, particularly in the industrial automation, industrial process monitoring, you start to see a lot of these applications, people either finding ways to replace other more expensive, more expensive, less performant, less reliable industrial computing platforms with Raspberry Pi, or of course, because of the lower capital cost of the device and the lower running cost of the device, because of course it's very power efficient, you're able to you're able to put intelligence and automation into the world in places where you couldn't previously have articulated a positive return on investment. There are two ways to win a return on investment argument. One is to increase the return, the other is to reduce the investment. By reducing the investment, both the capital and the running investment, Raspberry Pi kind of broadens people's ability to deploy intelligence in the world. The original Raspberry Pi organization is the Raspberry Pi Foundation. That's a UK registered not-for-profit, a UK registered charity. Fairly early on, about 9 months after we started shipping Raspberry Pi products, we separated that organization in two. So we put that business of developing the technical and brand IP of Raspberry Pi, we put that in a wholly owned subsidiary organization, which was then called Raspberry Pi Trading Limited. It's now called Raspberry Pi Limited. That frees the foundation. It isolates it turns out to be more tax efficient. UK charity tax law has a wrinkle that means that is a more tax efficient approach. It isolates risk. So it puts trading risk. The Charities Commission, I believe, are not especially keen on, so would probably not be keen on a charity trading at the levels that Raspberry Pi Limited now trades at. But most importantly, it provides for a division of attention between the two things that Raspberry Pi is trying to do. We are trying to reboot interest in computing among young people. That's a naturally charitable type of activity. And we are doing this both by making an affordable computing platform available, and by making profits selling that affordable platform, which can then be invested in educational activity. So it's natural to separate the organization like that. They are very different missions, and I run the second one. So having founded the first one, I now run Raspberry Pi Limited. We were very lucky to recruit a very talented chief executive, Philip Colligan, into the other role, into the chief executive seat at the foundation, where he's been now for very nearly 8 years. And so it's a structure that works well. It's a structure that divides responsibility. It's a structure that isolates risk. And in fact, there's no surprise that it is the structure that you would find in any mature UK-based trading charitable organization. the SoC that we use in Raspberry Pi 1, BCM2835, it's an interesting product. It had its origins as not as an application processor. So we talk about application processors, so something that has a CPU complex and then has most of the peripherals that you need built into the one piece of silicon or the peripherals that you need to build a general purpose computing device. 2835 actually did not start off as an application processor. It started off as a coprocessor. So it started off as a multimedia accessory chip that was intended to be used alongside an integrated base. Another phrase, integrated baseband. So an integrated baseband is a chip which has both a CPU, often some peripherals, and a cellular modem built into a single piece of silicon. So the architecture of the mobile phones is a mobile phone chip. The architecture of the mobile phones that you were intending to build was a two-chip solution where you had one chip that had generally an ARM processor and a cellular modem, and then another chip which provided all the multimedia functionality and some of the I/O functionality. So there was no intention to have in its first incarnation, this chip actually didn't have an open architecture general purpose CPU core in at all. And towards the end of the development of that chip, it did prove possible to introduce an ARM 11, an ARM 1176JZFS, the smallest modern ARM core that was available at the time. It was possible to find die area for that, and that was introduced into the chip. And that chip saw some success in a coprocessor role and also saw some success in an application processor role, of which the Raspberry Pi was probably the most successful of those roles. And then what you see over time is I think you can divide Raspberry Pi history into two phases, which is everything up to Raspberry Pi 3+, so Raspberry Pi 1, 1+, you mentioned sort of incremental generations, 1, 1+, 2, 3, 3+. All of that stuff, and then Raspberry Pi 4. The first generation is characterized by adding progressively larger and more performant ARM processor complexes to effectively the same piece of silicon. Actually, if you were to take the top off, if you were to decap the chip and look at the die, if you were to look at the GDS that goes to the foundry, you would see that the chips are very, very, very similar, actually. They have the system core, the majority of the kind of roughly square piece of silicon that implements the various multimedia functionality, provides the DRAM interface, most of the peripherals. That remains almost entirely untouched across generations. And on the left-hand side of that die, you then grow larger and larger and larger ARM complexes. That process has its limit. Those are all 40 nanometer chips. That process has its limit, and that limit is basically a thermal limit. It's how much energy to switch a transistor limit. You could take pretty much any ARM core if you wanted, synthesize it on 40 nanometers. You might not get the best clock speed in the world, but you could continue to do that process. Where we topped out was with the Cortex-A53, which at the time was the highest performing member of the in-order execution family of Cortex-A processors, succeeded in the end by Cortex-A55 and then by Cortex-A510. Going beyond that, going to one of the out-of-order cores, the A70X class cores, was clearly not going to work within the sort of per transistor energy budget on 40 nanometers, and there was a large effort then to take that device, modernize it in a variety of ways, modernize some of the multimedia functionality as well, and re-implement it on TSMC's 28 nanometer process. I think we're very lucky in that if you imagine that Raspberry Pi's original target audience was education, and its pre-launch target audience was education, and the audience that became apparent on that in the immediate run-up to launch and on that first day, the true audience that became apparent was a mixture of education and enthusiast. And we still talk, when we talk about our market segments, we still talk about an E&E segment, an education and enthusiast, or enthusiast and education segment. If you think that's where we've come from, and where we've gone to is a blend. We've grown a second market segment, which is the embedded and industrial, this E&I market that we talk about, embedded and industrial. We've been very lucky in that the decisions, we've very seldom had to make a decision, or almost never made a decision, to target one, we're certainly in the core product, the single board computer product, the kind of classic Raspberry Pi, the object you think about, the credit card size thing where you think about when you say Raspberry Pi. We've never had to make a decision in that space to favor one or the other markets. The same things you do to make a great educational computer or a great hobbyist hacking computer are also the things that make this computer great to stick on for sticking on a factory floor. These are all, education in your child's bedroom is actually it's a pretty brutal environment, right? Building something that can survive kids poking it with their staticky fingers all day, every day. That's not trivial. So I think what you've seen is, in terms of blend, you've seen a shift from almost entirely enthusiast in those 100,000 people on day one to a mixture enthusiast in education in the first few years, and then the gradual growth of industrial. And the route by which industrial grew for us is interesting, which is, we still have an orientation which is very much, in terms of our marketing orientation, it's very much towards the enthusiasts. But of course, what you've got to remember about enthusiasts is many of them are professional design engineers. And what's happened really is not so much that we have marketed this product into the industrial community, but that we have sold it to people who happen to work in the industrial world as a thing for them to use at the weekends, and then they bring it with them into work, and then their employer discovers that this is a useful platform for industrial computing. You've seen a couple of things, you've seen a couple of pieces of work for us in terms of product mix, which do attempt to target individual, one or other of those segments. From 2014 onwards, we've been making what we call compute module products. These are embeddable versions of kind of the brains of a Raspberry Pi on some much smaller carrier board that's designed to be integrated into a larger product. Originally SODIMM, so originally using a JEDEC, I think DDR2 SODIMM form factor, so you put an SODIMM connector down on your baseboard and clip in, and then from Compute Module 4 onwards, a rather different form factor. So those are products where the SBC is a product which serves both markets. The compute modules only serve the industrial market, and then Pi 400, which is the Raspberry Pi 4 integrated into a compact keyboard, that's clearly a purely consumer or purely educational product, and that rocked up at the end of 2020, actually in time to be of service to some of our pandemic mitigation work that we did in partnership with the foundation. I think the key decision for us in designing a new generation of Raspberry Pi or in designing some variant of Raspberry Pi is always to try not to put features in which will only be used by a minority of users. So the question is, for feature X, do I integrate it, or probably three choices. Do I integrate it? Do I produce an accessory product myself, which adds that functionality to the board for people who need it? Or do I rely on the market forces to generate that accessory? In terms of a financial, a heuristic that we often use, is we define, if we look at a feature that might cost, look at what a feature will cost, and we divide that cost through by the proportion of our customers who will use it. So a $1 feature which will be used by everybody weights the same as a 10-cent feature which will be used by a tenth of people. Really actually look at Raspberry Pi 1 through Raspberry Pi 4, enormous quantitative difference in performance, but qualitatively the only major functionality that's ever made that cut is wireless networking, wireless radio, as opposed to wired radio. Because that's something that really is useful. Maybe not to every single user, but certainly well over 50% of users. So you have a $1 to $2, generally the budget for radio on Raspberry Pi is $1 to $2. You have a $1 to $2 piece of functionality, which is used by north of half of people. So it weights at $2 to $3 probably. And that's enough, even on a $35 board, that's enough to justify putting it in the platform. Otherwise, look at something like machine learning. People wonder why Raspberry Pi does not have machine learning acceleration. It is absolutely not that we think that machine learning acceleration is a waste of time. It's just we think that it isn't of interest to sufficient of our users to justify integration into the core platform. So we put a lot of effort into being a good host for third-party. A good example of this would be the Google Coral USB accelerator. It's got about 2 TOPS of inference acceleration in a USB 3 form factor. We work hard to be a good host to third-party accelerator modules. There's certainly creative tension in terms of allocating die area between CPU and non-CPU functionality. If you think, if you were to, CPU performance, at least on a single core, is kind of the ultimate object which everyone needs, right? You can almost never have enough of it. You can start to argue, perhaps once you get past 2 or 3 cores, that that's not the case, right? In that, not everybody is running a workload which benefits even from having 2 cores, let alone 3 or 4 cores. So you could certainly make an argument that you would be better off. Would you rather have a system that has 2 very fast cores, or 4 medium performance cores whose aggregate performance adds up to more than the performance of the 2 cores, but it's provided in a less helpful way? It's provided as 4 threads rather than 2. So there's a space. So you can kind of imagine, looking back, would Raspberry Pi 3 have been a better product if it had had a pair of Cortex-A57 processors instead of 4 Cortex-A53 processors? Now, I think there are reasons why 57 would have been a poor choice, but you could certainly make that argument that you could go find one of the out-of-order cores, so maybe there's a little bit of tension there. There are of course non-technical considerations. We are a business and there are non-technical considerations. And so, a very performant dual-core architecture might still be beaten in the market by a less practically performant quad-core architecture, because people see 4 and go 4 is greater than 2. Yes, number go up, I'll have that, thank you very much. So there's certainly something around core choice and core count. There's something around the choice, the trade-off between core area and other area in the design. So you could imagine that you might choose to put more GPU area down and less CPU area, or vice versa. There's a question as to how many users of you could take it in the other direction. How many users of Raspberry Pi are really getting all of the value, getting all the performance out of that Video Core 6, on Raspberry Pi 4, that quite chunky Video Core 6 instance? Might you have been better off putting twice the size of the CPU L2 cache down and a much smaller 3D core? So there are, I don't think that there is there's always going to be some subjective, there are always going to be subjective aspects. There are always going to be aspects which are irrational, which are associated with purchasers' perception of the platform, rather than the actual performance of the purchaser will get from the platform when they, we all have our examples. VHS and Betamax is the most famous example that a well-pitched, well-marketed, technically inferior solution, if you're not careful, can wipe out a technically superior solution. So that's something we have to be conscious of. You could take it all the way up to the platform level. You could say, well, would we be better off having a more expensive SoC and less DRAM? Would we be better off having a cheaper SoC and more DRAM? Do we have users who'd like antenna diversity, who would pay some DRAM cost, who'd pay some DRAM capacity to save money to get themselves antenna diversity in Wi-Fi, or 6 gig Wi-Fi 6, or 6 gig tri-band Wi-Fi or something? You can always find these. You can always find these examples, but I think there are a small number of candidate trade-off points between these different aspects, and once you have that, you have to work hard. You have to think hard to identify what those points are, and then, having identified them effectively, it is a judgment call. It is a business and marketing side judgment call to pick which one you think is going to be the best choice. And we have always tried to pick one. This is back to this sort of slightly Henry Ford mindset we have. Business strategy is about what you don't do as much as it is about what you do. It isn't a strategy. If you choose to do everything, choosing to do everything is not a strategy and will turn out not to be feasible. So we do always try to pick one thing and do that thing well. I think there are 2 things that drew us to ARM-based to an ARM-based architecture. One is thinking back to those. So one's an emotional thing, right? I grew up with a Commodore Amiga, casting lustful glances at the Acorn Archimedes in the corner, right, which I could never possibly afford. So I was, some of my earliest experiences, I remember the very first computer magazine I ever bought, which was Microuser back in, it was an issue of Microuser back in 1988, and it had an article about the ARM architecture, and it talked about pipelining, and it talked about conditional execution, and branch prediction, the lack of branch prediction, and things. And so this is something I've been aware of for a long time, and it sort of was always aspirational to me as a child. So it's been very satisfying to me to produce the world's most successful ARM general purpose computers. But there's a practical aspect, which is that the early prototypes we made, these bare metal prototypes, you had to write everything. We had to write everything ourselves. So we were writing our own display driver software, our own SD card driver, and keyboard driver, and text editor. You're having to push water uphill on your own. And the benefit that we got from selecting a generally available processor and having that inside the application processor platform was that we could leverage all of the other work that happened. These standards create ecosystems, and the original ARM 32-bit instruction set standard created an ecosystem of kernel software, user land software that we were able to tap into. They provide platforms for a lot of different organizations which have different aims, organizations which are often compete with each other to do collaborative innovation. We couldn't have done Raspberry Pi if we'd had to build everything ourselves from scratch. When you go out and you look at what the licensable IP choices were at the time, this is a long time ago now. But even at that point, really, there was only one. It was a completely dominant architecture. There was only really one sensible choice. I suppose one could have put a MIPS. I suppose one could have put a MIPS processor in there. There was and remains quite an active ecosystem around the MIPS architecture, but really, ARM was the obvious choice. Now, I think it's important to remember that this is not in the context of big Raspberry Pi. So we now have the notion of big Raspberry Pi and little Raspberry Pi. The classic Raspberry Pi platform is still built on third-party silicon. But Raspberry Pi Pico, which is built on the RP2040 microcontroller, it's a new direction for Raspberry Pi. I think there was a feeling in the engineering team at Raspberry Pi that they'd used a lot of microcontrollers. Raspberry Pi is a great consumer of microcontrollers, a lot of microchip, Atmel, AVR8 microcontrollers, and those are lovely. That's a beautiful, it's a very nicely tuned architecture, AVR8. It has a ceiling. There's no obvious progression upwards from it, but within its space, AVR8 is wonderful. You consume a lot of it. I think there was a feeling that having done that, having spent within Raspberry Pi many years building Raspberry Pi accessory products using microcontrollers, and then individual team members having had long careers in which they'd used microcontrollers, there was a feeling that they could do better, that there were architectural insights in terms of what makes a microcontroller a good microcontroller, particularly thoughts around determinism and real-time interaction with the outside world, which weren't well addressed by devices that could be bought in the market. And of course, it was possible to go out and license the IP necessary, the core, license an ARM Cortex-M0 Plus in the case of that RP2040 device, license a core, get the ecosystem participation benefits from having a standards-based core, and then attempt to do innovation at the architectural level. This was. I don't want to speak for the team. I don't want to speak too much for the team who did the work, but I think when you look at the finished product, I think those ideas of determinism and real-time interaction. What differentiates RP2040 from other microcontroller platforms? You have two cores. You have a completely symmetrical two-core architecture. Should probably not say symmetric because that means something different. So it's asymmetric multiprocessing, but the two participating cores are identical. There's not a big and a little core. There are just two medium-sized cores. The notion there is that one core can supervise real-time, can supervise real-world activity in real time, while the other core runs application code runs user application code. There is a memory subsystem which supports this model of working. You have a fully connected AHB crossbar. It's a bandwidth model. RP2040 is we call it a bandwidth monster sometimes. It has a more application processor-like idea of how much is a good amount of bandwidth. You have about 2 gigabytes a second of theoretically achievable bandwidth inside the system. That's an AP-like amount of bandwidth. There's a reason why people do demos. There's been a lot of great RP2040 demos, notably at running Doom, notably at running a complete version of Doom, driving HDMI displays out of its GPIO pins. These are things that you can do because the system has a lot of bandwidth and is designed to ensure that bandwidth is actually available to clients. There are obviously trade-offs inside the RP2040 design. A lot of them are actually cost structure versus capability trade-offs. So you have a certain amount of memory, you have about 1/4 megabyte of memory. You have some relatively small integer-only ARM cores in M0+. There are other optimization, but you end up with about a 2 square millimeter. You end up with a 2 to 2.5 square millimeter die. That's the kind of, for me, the point at which it's not worth making the die that much smaller, because the overhead of the streets, the gaps that you leave between die starts to become prohibitive at that point. So you pattern yourself a nice expensive wafer and then you grind most of it to dust as you singulate the die. So you end up with a die which is close to the smallest feasible die area. That means we get about 21,000 die per wafer. One of the reasons why RP2040 has been very available during the global semiconductor shortage is simply that very small quantities of wafer supply from the foundry will sustain very large numbers, will allow us to build very, very large numbers of devices. But yeah, so there is a trade-off there. It enables sort of a 50 to 70 cent cost of the device in medium volume. So there are trade-offs there. They are primarily trade-offs between functionality and price. So you could imagine you could take the same design, you could put a Cortex, you could certainly take the same design, you could put a Cortex M33 in there, you could take the same design, you could put more memory in there, but you'd very rapidly find yourself with a device which would occupy a $1 to $2 price point rather than a 50 cent to $1 price point. So there's a lot of effort has gone in there. You can certainly argue that the memory subsystem is overspec'd, that this kind of fully connected memory subsystem is overspec'd. But actually, when you look at the die area, when you look at that, sort of your nice coloured layout showing you which bits of the sea of digital logic correspond to which bits of functionality. What's really striking is that the fabric, even this rather deluxe, certainly by microcontroller standards, rather deluxe system fabric, it's almost invisible even on the scale of a 2 square millimeter chip. Supercomputers are an interesting area, an interesting application field for Raspberry Pi that I'm pretty sure when we started, we never envisaged a lot of the things that people do with Raspberry Pis, but certainly building supercomputers was not one of them. If you look at modern supercomputers, they're often they're composed of collections of they're called white box supercomputers. They're composed of collections of basically PC hardware connected together by some form of multi-dimensional high-performance fabric, which you can approximate to being a bunch of Ethernet. Now, if you own one of these, and people who own these large supercomputers, they tend to be people who want to do computational fluid dynamics, solve large computational fluid dynamics problems. If you own one of these supercomputers, you generally only own 1 or 2 of them, and they're generally busy being used to do whatever fluid dynamics simulation it is you want to do. And so when you onboard new engineers into your organization and you want to train them in the way that you would partition a workload for this rather interesting non-uniform environment, you don't necessarily want to use the big machine to train people. And so what we've seen a number of people doing on a number of different scales is to take Raspberry Pi hardware and use it to build a scaled model of, so you use Raspberry Pi and Ethernet to build a scale model of these complicated systems. So you take 10,000 Raspberry Pis, connect them together, we're using 1000 or gigabit Ethernet, and you have something which is a 1%, 2%, 5% scale model of your big machine. People can get comfortable with that and then transition onto the big machine without wasting anyone's time. And that's probably the most, I would say that is the most, certainly the most non-uniform, the most modern use of Raspberry Pi, certainly the biggest use, the highest end use of Raspberry Pi, and probably architecturally the most modern use of Raspberry Pi. That's a fun question. We don't talk about unannounced products. Look, I mean, I think I can make a few general comments. I think obviously we've been set back by the pandemic and then by the supply chain shortage. The pandemic limits to the extent that people can't get in a room together. Another reason why engineering is a fun thing to do is it's a social activity. Actually, lockdown was not bad for short-term engineering productivity because people were stuck at home with nothing to do other than do the work on the tasks that they'd already been assigned. Where it hurt in terms of productivity was when it was deciding what to do next is a social activity. So we've definitely been delayed there. The global supply chain crisis, which followed the initial onset of the pandemic, obviously also means that a lot of effort within the organization has been focused on sustaining the existing products rather than on deciding what to do next. So there are some challenges there. I think by and large, and so we're some distance away from being able to, even if we did talk about unannounced products, we're some distance away from having an unannounced product to talk about. I think you would probably expect to see, I talked a little bit about some of the design philosophy, the engineering design philosophy that's underpinned the Raspberry Pi program. So I think that probably the philosophy stays the same, and therefore some of the outputs will be fairly predictable. So I think you are likely to see platforms which look physically like Raspberry Pis. I think the form factors that we have, the single board computer, the module, and potentially the 400 type computer and a keyboard type form factors, they're all good form factors. So I suspect you would probably see those form factors continue into the future. I think you would see the changes being more quantitative than qualitative changes, so more of everything, faster processors, more memory, more multimedia performance, new video standards, some of these things which are, it's a fairly, the specification process when it happens, I think will be a fairly handle-turning activity. There'll be some trade-offs, but effectively identifying the area of the area of maxima in the configuration space will be pretty straightforward, and probably the prejudices, biases that I'll bring to the table when we pick which one of those configurations actually gets made will probably be the same. So I would think you see just everything rise up a little bit. Microcontroller side, so that's where we're developing our own silicon. I think there are some lessons that we can draw. RP2040 is an amazing product. It's done very well in the market. It's obviously been flattered a little bit by its availability at a time when almost nothing else is available, but it's been successful in the market over the couple of years since we launched it. I think there are some obvious ways in which it was a pathfinder product. I imagine in the future one might see some more focus on security. One might see some more focus on power, and in particular low power states, which is not something that the RP2040 has been optimized for. So you might see some, you'll probably see some quantitative change as well, but there are some obvious examples. Some maybe some thoughts about on chip non-volatile storage. RP2040 is funny because it's completely stateless. There's nothing you can do. There's no OTP, there's no flash on that device. Every RP2040 is exactly the same as it was the day it came out of the factory. And that's fine in a lot of ways, but it does mean, for example, one can't store cryptographic keys in the design, and then that couples through into potential security models. We've seen enormous improvements in the level of interest in computing among young people in the roughly 12 years that we've been doing Raspberry Pi. And we've seen enormous improvements in parallel with that. We've seen enormous improvements in the competence of the education system to address that interest. We're not the only contributor to either of these two things. One of the really heartening things about Raspberry Pi has been that while we felt we were kind of a voice in the wilderness back in 2008, 2009, 2010 when we first started talking about this, at roughly the same time that Raspberry Pi went to scale in 2011, 2012, 2013, lots of other organizations appeared that were trying to solve the same problem in different ways. Nobody else was trying to solve the problem really by generating a piece of computer hardware. But there were club networks, there were teacher support networks, there were organizations which were lobbying for curriculum reform and better teacher training. And so what you've seen is an increase in the number of people applying to computer science. If you think, what's our single scalar number that measures how things are going? It's the number of applicants. Each December we go and we ask the university how many people applied to study computer science at the University of Cambridge. And that number went from about 600 at the end of the 1990s down to a little over 200 in 2008. And last year was between 14 and 1,500. So you have roughly 2.5 times as many people applying to study computer science now at Cambridge as we had at the height of the dot-com boom, when people had a perception that capability in computing was going to be a meal ticket for you. So that's a really good development. It's been enabled by Raspberry Pi. You talk to a lot of these kids about how did you get involved in computing. Lots of them say Raspberry Pi. Interestingly, lots of them say robotics with Raspberry Pi. So physical computing, in terms of you think about what are the aspects of the platform which people find appealing, what are the aspects of the platform which are differentiating, what are the things you can do with a Raspberry Pi that you can't necessarily do, at least with an augmented PC or Mac. It's the physical interfacing capabilities, which for me as a software engineer actually were very much a secondary factor when we put the platform out. These were things which Pete Lomas, my co-founder, was much more passionate about than me, and it was his insistence we included interfacing capabilities, serious hardware interfacing capabilities in the platform. So we've seen an increase in interest among young people. On the support side, so that's the kind of demand side. On the supply side, we've seen the growth of these club networks, in particular Code Club and Coder Dojo, which are now started as independent organizations in 2012 and are now both part of the Raspberry Pi Foundation. And then on the formal education side, we first in the UK saw curriculum reform under the coalition government, the disapplication of the programme of study for the rather office skills-focused ICT curriculum and its replacement with a really very robust, very rigorous computing curriculum. I remember seeing drafts of this when talking to Simon Peyton-Jones at Microsoft Research here in Cambridge, and seeing drafts of this curriculum as it evolved over the year or so before it was introduced, and waiting for it to become rubbish. Waiting for somebody to get their hands on it and make it bad, and then waking up one day and realizing that nobody had got round to corrupting the essential awesomeness of the English computing curriculum. That was introduced. Obviously, that was extremely valuable in that it meant that the formal education system was no longer pulling against the goals of the informal education system. That was really very valuable. What was missing, and was missing for kind of a shockingly long time in the UK, was the teacher training commitment to correspond to that curriculum change. So you take teachers who had been often, ICT was taught by, was not the primary subject of the people delivering it. And that was bad enough. But if you then ask people to teach Python as not their primary, Scratch or Python, or data structures and algorithms, when it's not their primary subject, and they haven't been provided with CPD, that's an awful thing to do. It's an awful thing to do to teachers, and it's an awful thing to do to kids. So a few years ago, there was then this follow-on investment in teacher training. That's gone very well. The UK now has a formidably well-trained cohort. It's an ongoing, it's a painting the fourth bridge task. It will be an ongoing task for the whole of my life. As new teachers come in and as older teachers require a refresh of their skills, but we do have a formidably motivated and formidably well-educated set of computing teachers in the UK. Now, at the same time, it's very UK-centric. Raspberry Pi is a global organization. On the engineering side, roughly 95% of Raspberry Pis are exported out of the UK. So our informal impact is worldwide. We are seeing the things that happened in the UK to generate reform happened in lots of other places at the same time. In some of those places, Raspberry Pi, the foundation, has been active in some of those places. It hasn't been present. Those things have just happened without Raspberry Pi. I think what you're going to see over the next few years is, certainly in low and middle income countries, you're going to see Raspberry Pi the Raspberry Pi Foundation attempt to apply, in a localized way, some of the skills that it has, some of the experience, some of the collateral that it's developed in the UK, in particular in the English environment, attempt to apply some of those assets to drive forwards the state of computing education. And the wonderful thing, of course, I've been lucky to go out and see some of the early aspects of these engagements, the level of enthusiasm, hunger, desire for STEM education, for computing education as a way to drive forward the economic development of these countries and the individual personal development of their citizens. It puts us to shame in this country. I actually think in the UK we've done a pretty good job, but you go to Ghana and you see the amount of enthusiasm. Go to Kenya, you see the amount of enthusiasm and the amount of excitement for STEM education. I think it puts us to shame. Well, I try not to draw lessons from Raspberry Pi's success because so much of what we've done has come from luck, and so many of the things that have happened to us have been very, very contingent. I would say that the engineering has a strange image problem, right? I don't actually think it has an image problem among children. I think it has an image problem among parents. I think that there are not, if you look at the life of an engineer, you look at my life, you look at the things that I have been able to do in my life, because as a young person, I learned to program a computer, I've been able to travel around the world, and I've been able to hang out with very, very bright people. I'm able to sit indoors and be fed a new problem a day for my entire life. Be well paid to, I call it playing with Lego sometimes, I get to just solve problems every day and be well paid to do it. I can't conceive of why someone would not want that for their child as an experience. So I think we just try to be, in terms of, advice for people in their careers. I've always advocated, and I think we as an organisation have always advocated, that people should put themselves in the way of interesting experiences. People should try to develop skills, try to be good at something. Actually it doesn't need to be engineering, but try to be good at something. Try to do your 10,000 hours in something. And in my case, that was always, that was very definitely computer programming. Try to meet interesting people. Try to put yourself. Talk about luck. There's this sort of saying that luck is where preparation meets opportunity. I think life often serves up opportunities, and the people who do best out of the opportunities are the people who've prepared. And preparation looks like practice at something. Meet interesting people, work hard at developing some skills, any skill. The things that you'll learn in trying to develop skills probably outweigh the specific value of the skill you learn. The person you become while you're trying to learn a skill is so much more valuable. And the most interesting people, the people I have met and the people I respect most, the people I've met over the course of the Raspberry Pi program, certainly, they often didn't have these very linear, predictable routes into what they're doing. They're people who ended up, getting to very senior engineering positions by leaving school at 16 and going into apprenticeships. People who have cross-trained from other subjects. One of the most fascinating people I know, and I think I mentioned this in my talk at Pembroke, one of the most fascinating people I know is actually he's an amazing singer. He's an amazing classical singer, but he also has a PhD in computer science, and he has seen his investment in, he's made an investment in himself as an engineer, specifically in order to allow himself to take more risk in his personal life with the thing which is his great passion, which is singing, because he knows he can take more risk in that space, because he knows that he has this other thing that he is able to fall back on. So people make very interesting, I think there are a million ways to make interesting life choices. And the one that the one way that the dominant culture encourages you to think is probably one of the worst. I'm a software engineer, right? used to write computer games when I was a child on my BBC and on my Commodore Amiga. I had a game startup when I was an undergraduate here in Cambridge, and I was a very late comer to electronics, and I'm not a great I'm not a great electrical engineer. I design chips, but that's an architectural role, not a detailed implementation role. But there is something about, for me, there was something intoxicating about it. I'm hard pressed not to see it as my gambler's instinct, really. That there's nothing quite like, you can't ship a patch to a piece of hardware. It works or it doesn't. And while semiconductor development, well, ASIC development, certainly digital ASIC development, is very much recognizably a programming. It feels like software, right? You're writing Verilog, you're writing a synthesizable HDL, and then at some point you press a button. It's a little bit more than pressing a button, but that gets turned into a physically manufacturable object, a GDS, that can be used to pattern a wafer. It is nonetheless the case that in the end, physical objects are being made, and the upfront cost associated with making one of those things is pretty eye-watering. So a dedicated tape-out, even on an older process node, will cost you $1 million. An MPW tape-out, a shuttle, a shared tape-out, will cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it is not unheard of for the result to be effectively a resistor. For the thing to come back, if you do your job badly, then the thing that comes back is worthless or is very, very badly flawed, or may not yield. The middle ground is something where 1% of the chips that come back are okay, but they won't yield economically because you've done something that there is some marginality in the design that means that you don't see sustainable yield. And so there is something kind of wonderful compared to the software world where everything is very fluid and fixable and patchable, and the notion of the eternal public beta in a sort of slightly googly world where many of your projects never emerge even after many years from being defined as being in public beta. None of the chips we use in any Raspberry Pi product are in public beta, right? And we've had a few close shaves over the years. So I wonder if the thing that drew me to, I've always been interested in business, and of course business is a form of gambling. And I don't actually like gambling, but there is something about hardware which is higher stakes and therefore more fun. And the other thing is, someone has to do it. It's very easy to imagine that we can live in a world of pure software, but in the end, software requires. I mentioned this idea of reluctant. Hardware companies, companies that really want to be software companies, but have to build some hardware to run it on. In the end, we can't all be software engineers. Somebody has to be a hardware engineer, and there's still enormous progress. We're coming towards the end of the classic era. We probably are at the end of the classic era of performance scaling of Moore's law, well past the end actually. The classic era of relatively predictable and straightforward performance scaling from Moore's law. We are to some extent running out of atoms now. There aren't that many more process nodes to go, certainly in classical or even the rather fancy modern version of classical CMOS. But there still are amazing challenges, and one of the biggest ones is, what do we do next? So I think it's an exciting. It'll be software engineers' time for a little while, because software has been able to coast for a long time on the performance delivered by hardware engineers. I think it'll be software's time for a while to have a think about how it copes, how the software world copes without the endless supply of performance increase from the hardware world. But I think while that is happening, I think the hardware engineers are going to have a lot of fun figuring out where we go next.